My name is Owen McCafferty. I'm the president of the International Association of Germans from Lithuania and one of the founding members. We also have another founding member here, Cynthia Jacobson, who's also our chief editor. And today we're going to be talking about an introduction to the Deutsche aus Litauen, or Germans from Lithuania. And this really is a SparkNotes version of the history of the Germans from Lithuania to just give everybody an understanding of who this population is. And although this is very much centered around this population of ethnic Germans that lived in Southwest Lithuania, a lot of our resources at the IAGL do focus on the greater Suwalki Gubernaya, or Suwalki area of the former Russian Empire, and are really focused around records of the Lutheran churches there. So even for those who do not necessarily have Lithuanian German roots, but maybe have roots in the Suwalki Gubernaya, like cities in Suwalki or Augustovo, Białystok, Wyżany, may also find this presentation interesting, because towards the end we'll talk about some resources that are available for records. So, I could easily, as Cynthia knows, I can ramble on for hours and hours on this conversation. So I'm really trying to keep it very condensed to give people enough information to understand when somebody says Deutsche aus Litauen, we understand who those people are and where they came from, and just a broad understanding of what their history is. So for the agenda today, I'll introduce the IAGL. I sort of did that already, but then I'm really going to spend a lot of time defining who the Deutsche aus Litauen were, where they lived, and we'll touch on the fact that there are actually a number of groups of ethnic Germans in Lithuania. The Deutsche aus Litauen are a distinct group within the kind of the larger scope of Germans in Lithuania. And then I'll go over a very brief history of the Germans from Lithuania, starting with the earliest Germans that were settling in the area, all the way up until where the Deutsche aus Litauen are today. Again, this is, I tried to condense it as much as I could, because quite honestly, each one of these points I could spend probably 2 hours a piece just talking about the certain aspects of their history. And then we'll talk about some of the records and resources, not just at the IAGL, but just in general, if you're researching individuals in this particular area. And then I'll open it up to questions. So the International Association of Germans from Lithuania, our purpose is to document and share the history and culture of ethnic Germans from southwestern Lithuania by providing genealogical and historical resources to the public. We are a not-for-profit founded in Cleveland, Ohio. We were officially founded in September of last year. I do want to be careful about the word ethnic Germans. I mean ethnic in the modern sense of the word, not in the past sense of the word. When I say ethnic Germans, I'm really talking about people who identify themselves as German. They may have different ethnicities as well, Lithuanian or Polish, even Russian. But a group of people who identified themselves as German for whatever reason. The IAGL actually came about as a result of an indexing project that I had started just for my own personal use. I had started indexing these and transcribing these church records so that I could more easily do research on my own, and ended up finding this amazing Lithuanian genealogy group on Facebook, and found that other people were sort of doing the same thing. So I posted my transcriptions, and people were so happy to have them that I ended up connecting with another woman based out of Germany who was interested in sort of helping me do this, because her ancestors were from the same area. And we started transcribing thousands and thousands of these records and putting them on spreadsheets. And as the spreadsheets grew and grew, we realized it was really hard to navigate through them, and decided we wanted to build a searchable database online where somebody could just simply type in a name and search the records. And that's how the our indexing project came about. I then realized that if I had gotten hit by a bus, the next day, a lot of this information and access to the records would disappear. So I connected with Cynthia, who had a blog of her own, and she very much was an inspiration, not just for my own research, but also for the IAGL. We connected and decided that we were going to create this association, and also ended up inviting other people to our board. Alan Schlosser and Alvin Hirsch both are very accomplished genealogists in this area as well. So we now have them on board. And as far as what the organization does and how it's really set up is very much based on the former Landsmannschaft der Deutschen aus Litauen, which was based in Germany for over 60 years. And unfortunately, just very recently, the association officially disbanded, really because of the people who were running it and a lot of the members had simply aged out or had passed away. And so our association, one of the goals I really have is to kind of pick up that torch and continue to offer information and resources for the next generation of people who are interested in this topic. So that's the IAGL, and now we really need to define who these Deutsche aus Litauen were. And to do that, I think the best place to start is really a understanding of place. Geographically, where were these people located? This, of course, is a map of modern Europe, and we see Lithuania. I'll admit that when I started doing this back when I was 13, 14 years old, I couldn't tell you where Lithuania was on a map. I knew nothing about Lithuania, certainly had no idea there were Germans there. So here we have Lithuania bordered by Latvia, Belarus, and Poland, and also the Kaliningrad Oblast or Kaliningrad Territory that was once part of East Prussia. And I've circled there southwest Lithuania because that's really where this group of Germans was from. And as you'll see in a little bit, there were other groups of Germans. We have the Prussian Lithuanians up in the Memeland, and also the people I call the early Germans that were settled much longer before the Deutsche aus Litauen in places like Vilnius, and Kaunan. So if we zoom into southwest Lithuania, this is a really helpful map because we created this to do two things. Number one, it shows where the scope of the IAGL's records and interest is. You can see these cities, Sudgaris, all the way down as south as Augustów in Poland, and going out west into Garlava and Serie. And this is really the scope of where our resources and interest are in this region here. That was at one part of the Suwałki gubernia of the Russian Empire, but also really gives a good understanding of the geography and the fact that these areas were once part of the Russian Empire, also part of East Prussia, and also shows the territory in relation to the Memeland, which we'll talk about, where the Prussians from Lithuania were a different group. So this gives a good sense of place and also an understanding of where exactly these people settled and where our resources are. And I'll refer back to this a couple of times during the presentation. So we talked a little bit about where we're really referencing here in modern terms, in the modern map of Europe here in southwest Lithuania, but obviously Europe looked very different 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So if we step back in time, we really need to understand what Europe and southwest Lithuania looked like before 1794 or 1795, 1794. And I'm really kind of starting at a certain point just to give context of the Germans from Lithuania. If I had to explain the history of Lithuania and Poland, that would take up almost an entire day. So I'm really kind of picking a place and time to give some context behind the history of this group. But here we have the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland sort of superimposed on a modern map of Lithuania. And we can see Lithuania falls within the Grand Duchy of Lithuania that includes Belarus as well as parts of mainland Russia and the Kingdom of Poland. And as many people will know, this was once part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And eventually this area got partitioned, particularly 3 times that will be important to understand for the history of the Deutsche aus Litauen. But this area was ruled by a single king at one time, the King of Poland and the King of the Duchy of Lithuania. And the third partition of Poland, which happens in 1795, is perhaps, in the terms of the Germans from Lithuania, is one of the more significant partitions because this area that's here in light blue is the partition in 1795. And this area goes to Prussia, becomes a territory called Neue Ostpreußen, or New East Prussia. And this area here really is southwest Lithuania. If we go back to the map earlier, it includes the area that all of our cities of interest really are in, and even more than that. And as we'll see in a little bit, that's really where the Deutsche aus Litauen, that's when they really start to arrive in what is today Lithuania, when New East Prussia becomes part of the Prussian Empire in 1795. Of course, in 1807, Prussia is defeated by Napoleon, quite embarrassingly to them. And this area is eventually handed over to the Russian Empire in 1807. And we end up looking at a map in 1815 with the area looking like this, very, very different. Now we have Russia, we have the Austrian Empire, and of course Brandenburg Prussia. And our little area, Southwest Lithuania, is now incorporated into a territory called Congress Poland, which many people, at least here in the U.S., would know as Russia Poland. And within Congress Poland, there were different governance or gubernias. You could think of them like U.S. states. And the Southwest Lithuania becomes part of the Suwalki gubernia, which I pointed to with the area or the arrow there. And it was split up in different administrative divisions. Here in green, we have the Suwalki gubernia, and there are other ones as part of Russia, Poland. And the area circled in red is just giving more context to where the Germans from Lithuania lived. We have the different administrative divisions: Mariampol, Kalvaria, Sezhny, and Augustov. And then, of course, we have the capital of the gubernia, Suwalki. And this is really what the area looked like, essentially, from about 1815 until the start of the First World War, when Germany invades Lithuania, and it becomes part of the Oberost territory. And again, this is the current scope of the IAGL. Now, there were Deutsche aus Litauen living outside of this area, but as we'll see in a little bit, the concentration of the population really was in this area. So, of course, in 1915, we have World War I. And eventually, after Germany loses the war, Lithuania declares independence and becomes its own nation. And here we actually have a map from 1941. And unfortunately, I forgot to put my source in there, but this is available online through Columbia University's website. But the map actually represents the population density of ethnic Germans identified in the 1923 Lithuanian census. And here again, we have the circle signifying Southwest Lithuania, formerly part of the Suwalki gubernia of the Russian Empire. And as you can see, the red dots represent the amount of Germans in the particular area, and overwhelmingly, they are living in Southwest Lithuania. Now, of course, you see the red dots outside of that area. We have Germans living all the way up north, but even closer to what was the Memeland. And so, although the scope of the IAGL does not include resources from these areas, they do sort of fit into that group. But obviously, the concentration of the Deutsche aus Litauen near East Prussia really means that their connection to German culture and the border with East Prussia really does signify them as a sort of different group. They were more connected to what they would call the fatherland because of the fact that they were just in close proximity. This map isn't exactly accurate for two reasons. Number one, the 1923 Lithuanian census the census officials had issues with who they were identifying as being German. In some cases, they were identifying anybody who was a Lutheran as German, even though that might include ethnic Lithuanians who at some point converted to Lutheranism or Protestantism. But the other thing is that they also, the people who were being taken as part of the census really did confuse what nationality meant. If they were asked about nationality, they may assume that meant their citizenry, which is Lithuanian, not necessarily their ethnic background. So in my opinion, most of these places outside of Southwest Lithuania, probably if we were to more accurately be able to record that information, those areas that actually have ethnic Germans would probably have decreased, and Southwest Lithuania would probably have incurred an increase in the amount of Germans who were identified there. So now that we have a sense of place and a sense of geography, now we need to talk about who these people were and why they are a sort of separate group from the other Germans living in different parts of Lithuania. I see this as being three groups of Germanic people in Lithuania. We have the Prussian Lithuanians of the Memeland, which is up here by what is now today Klaipėda, and includes sort of the surrounding territories. We have the early Germans, the people I call the early Germans, some of the first Germanic people from Hanseatic cities who settled beginning in the 13th century, although some scholars argue that there were people crossing into Lithuania as far back as the Middle Ages. But we know significant amounts came to urban cities like Kaunas and Vilnius, or Kaun and Vilna, really as a result of those cities getting Magdeburg rights. But they were living particularly in this area by Kaunas and Vilnius, and were really concentrated there. I'll talk a little bit more about them. So those are the early Germans. And then we have the Deutsche aus Litauen living in southwest Lithuania. And their timeline of immigration, when they came to Lithuania, why they came, are a distinct difference. Each one of these groups have a very different timeline and very different motivations for coming to Lithuania. And of course, when they came and where they lived also determined whether or not they were living in Prussia, Russia, or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So those are just very distinct groups. So the early Germans, as I said earlier, some scholars believe ethnic Germans have been coming to Lithuania going back to the Middle Ages, but in very small numbers. We're talking about 1, 2, 3 individuals at a time. But by the early 15th century, some of Lithuania's main urban cities, such as Vilna and Kaun, give Magdeburg rights, and so small communities of German clergy, monks, merchants, craftsmen come to this area from other Hanseatic cities, not necessarily from East Prussia or West Prussia. Here we have a picture of Deutsche Straße in Vilna. That's what the street was known as for many, many years. Above it is the Lithuanian word for German street. And it was they lived in this area from about the 15th century until the late 17th and early 18th centuries, when the Germans were being pushed out of the area, particularly to avoid persecution by Catholic clergy. But some did remain, again, in small numbers. But the important distinction here is that they really were concentrated in these urban cities. The number of Germans outside of the urban area living in rural areas as farmers or as craftsmen were almost non-existent. And again, when we get into the middle of the 18th century, these communities really start to shrink as they leave the area. Then we have the Prussian Lithuanians, or living in what is known as Lithuanian Minor. And here I have a map of the Memeland, and it bordered East Prussia. And again, a distinct group, because the Memeland belonged to Prussia from 1422 until the end of World War I. The people living in this territory were Prussians. They were Prussian citizens. They belonged to the Prussian Empire. They were made up of different ethnic groups. You have, sort of the people originating from the Baltic or Old Prussians, the people who lived in East Prussia before the Teutonic Knights captured the area. Common misconception is that the entire population was wiped out by the Teutonic Knights, which is 100% not true. Although a lot of the population was decimated, they were integrated into Prussian society, and you can see that in the names of their descendants even today. You also have the Germanic people that were settling in the area, and then you do have native Lithuanians who had been living in the area for generations. After 1918, between 1918 and 1923, the Memeland is sort of in limbo as far as who controls it. Although the vast majority of the population were Prussians who were German, who spoke German, and very much wanted to remain part of Germany. In 1923, Lithuania actually occupies the area and takes it, and it becomes under Lithuanian control and becomes part of Lithuania. In 1939, of course, Hitler starts to invade Europe and starts to recapture lands that were lost as part of the Versailles Treaty. And in 1939, Lithuania is presented with an ultimatum, and eventually they acquiesced the Memeland back to Nazi Germany. And so really only belonged to Lithuania from 1923 until 1939. So again, another point to say that the people living in this area, and this is probably one of the more common confusions, is when we say Deutsche aus Litauen, people assume that either only includes the Memeland or includes the Memeland with Southwest Lithuania. And our argument is that it shouldn't, because these people have a different history, they have a different timeline, they have a different culture. Then we come to the Deutsche aus Litauen. And the Deutsche aus Litauen story really does begin in 1795. If we remember back to the third partition of Poland, southwest Lithuania and other parts of Lithuanian Poland are partitioned to East Prussia, and that territory becomes Neue Ostpreußen, New East Prussia. It only exists from 1795 until 1807, but in 1795, the Prussian government wanted people to settle in this area of southwest Lithuania. And so they ended up sending who they called colonists. Many of them were actually sponsored by the state or were part of the Prussian army. They were small numbers, but it was the first significant migration of individuals from East Prussia coming over what was the border of Russia, or really the border of Lithuania, and began settling in these rural areas, these farmlands. And even after Prussia is defeated by Napoleon in 1807 and Neue Ostpreußen is lost, those colonists stayed. And in fact, they continued to come over even after the area was lost to Russia. So the height of immigration, so we have 1795 is sort of when it starts. Small numbers, not entirely significant. When does the big migration happen? Well, when you look at the church books of the Lutheran churches in southwest Lithuania, and you read through where the places of origins are, you see that overwhelmingly they are from East Prussia, and the church communities start to grow in these areas of southwest Lithuania. Really in the late 1830s and into the early 1840s, you have the establishment of a number of evangelical Lutheran churches in southwest Lithuania. And so the height of the immigration happens in the 1830s throughout the 1860s. And they were coming mainly from, here we have a map from East Prussia in 1905, but it just sort of shows, if you look at the blue area, the Gumbinnen administrative district, this is where a lot of the Deutsche aus Litauen came from, especially in those areas just bordering the southwest Lithuanian border, Kreis Pekalen, Kreis Stoljupen, Goldap, etc. My own family is from the Stoljupen area. Most people kind of come from that region in East Prussia. As far as why they came, their motivations really included, were really mostly, economic. They wanted cheap arable land, and they could find that in Lithuania, again, technically part of the Russian Empire at this point. In some cases, the land was being given away. The ability to establish trades without guild restrictions. Of course, in East Prussia, if you wanted to become a master blacksmith or a master carpenter, you had to go through this sort of guild process that you didn't have to do in Russia. And then cheaper taxes. And especially for those who were poor or were part of the peasant class in East Prussia, it was very hard to get a sizable amount of land for yourself. And that was something you were able to do in Lithuania, again, Russia. And also the fact that serfdom had been stopped in the Russian Empire many years before it had in East Prussia. By the late 1860s, another interesting motivational factor is that the railroads started to become popular and started to be built. And the Russian Empire really did not have skilled craftsmen to help build the railroads, whether carpenters or blacksmiths. And so they really wanted to tempt East Prussians to come over because they knew that those individuals had the skills they needed. Immigration to Lithuania from East Prussia really starts to drop off by the late 1890s, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. But that's really where we start to see the immigration numbers from East Prussia into Lithuania recede. So as far as the occupations, religion, and culture of these Deutsche aus Litauen, the majority of them lived and worked in rural villages, unlike the native Lithuanians and the Poles, and especially the Jewish community, who tended to live more in the cities, in the city centers where they had butchers and businesses of their own. The Germans tended to live in the rural areas as farmers. Farming and farm work is by far the most common occupation, but certainly not the only one. They were the first group to bring a lot of modern farming methods to Lithuania, such as mechanicalized farming implements, and also the first to bring chemical fertilizers to the area. And so they really became a role model for the native Lithuanian farmers to see kind of the advancements of farming techniques that were happening in East Prussia now being brought into Lithuania. And of course, many native Lithuanians that were there worked on German farms. My own family had a number of German farmhands that worked on the farm there. Other common skills and really skilled trades include blacksmiths, carpenters, millers, tanners, brewers, wheelwrights, butchers. There was a vast variety of different crafts. It was not uncommon also for people to not just only do farming, but to have these other skilled trades as well. And then many who lived close to the East Prussian border and could, essentially see it from their home, also would live in Lithuania, and it was not uncommon for them to go to East Prussia to work for extended periods of time, bring back Prussian marks to Russia, to their family. Here we have a typical Deutsche aus Litauen farmer working with his horses there. As far as their culture, obviously it's sort of logical, but the Deutsche aus Litauen's culture was heavily influenced by East Prussian culture because that's where most of them came from, but also they were right near the East Prussian border. But there was definitely influence by Lithuanian culture, by Polish culture, by Russian cultures. One thing many people don't realize is that this area, the Suwałki Gubernaya of the Russian Empire, was extremely diverse compared with a lot of other places in Europe. You have Russians living there, you have Lithuanians, Poles, Latvians, people from Belarus, and then of course even in Suwałki itself, which is today in Poland, you even have a Muslim population as well. There were most Deutsche aus Litauen were at the very least bilingual, German and Lithuanian, and those who have roots in this area, have relatives from this area, especially those whose ancestors were born there, will often tell stories about how they would converse with their parents in German, but then they had this secret language of Lithuanian that they would speak to each other in when they didn't want their children to know what they were saying. But it's very common to be bilingual. Even more common was for people to be trilingual, to speak German, Lithuanian, and Polish, or Russian, or a combination. But many, for example, most of the people in my family spoke all of these languages: German, Lithuanian, Polish, Russian, and even Yiddish. Unfortunately, the Jewish population was exterminated during the war, during World War II. But before then, there was a very significant Jewish population in Southwest Lithuania, and they because they were in the cities and had many businesses and they were involved in banking. Most of the Deutsche aus Litauen worked and saw these Jewish individuals every day. They were friends, they were neighbors. And so it was not uncommon for people to know at least enough Yiddish to be able to communicate with others. As far as their dialect of German, of course, no surprise, it was really a dialect of East Prussian Plattdeutsch, but there were influences from Lithuanian and the Polish languages. You can see that in some of the words that were common in the area that they used. But it was very common for people to speak in sort of a mixed language as they talked to each other. They would be speaking in German, and all of a sudden they would start speaking in Lithuanian, and then they'd switch to Polish. So they really did have a pretty immense knowledge of these languages. Another interesting part of the culture of the Germans from Lithuania is an organization that was formed in the 1920s after Lithuanian independence called the Kulturverband. And that was established to really protect the legal rights of the German minority in Lithuania during the years of independence. And so in addition to that, of course, it also promoted German culture and German organizations within Lithuania. Fortunately, towards the beginning of World War II, it really does become heavily influenced by Nazi propaganda. But before then, it really was there to preserve the culture of the area and protect the rights of the Germans there. Here we have a picture of the entitled "The Pretty Mayellen of Verballen." Those of you who are familiar with East Prussian Plattdeutsch will probably know the word Marschellen, which is essentially the word for young girls or a maiden. And here we have a picture of those from Verballen. And you can see the sort of traditional dress as well. As far as religion, it's no surprise that the Deutsche aus Litauen were evangelical Lutherans. Nearly all of them were. Some did belong to the Reformed Lutheran churches in the area, such as the one in Serie, but most of them belonged to the evangelical faith. The churches were founded, again, as I mentioned earlier, mostly in the 1830s and 40s, but some are much older, such as the one in Serrier, which was founded in the 16th century. And of course, the church was really the center of life for these Deutsche aus Litauen, because it was often where they got education. It's where they learned German in some cases. And it was at these places where German celebrations and other parties and things like that were celebrated. So it really does become the center of life for this community. And especially for those from East Prussia that have Salzburger roots, for the Salzburger exiles, because, of course, their evangelical faith was of immense pride to them, since they were kicked out of their homeland in Salzburg and had to come to East Prussia. So religion was very important to them. It was very much a sense of who they were. So I talked a little bit about immigration. Of course, many of Deutsche aus Litauen left Southwest Lithuania, particularly in the years between 1890 and the turn of the century. And in fact, the immigration rates to the U.S. from the Suwalki Gubernaya of the Russian Empire was one of the highest in the empire by the 1890s. The reasons for this were multifaceted. One, of course, was labor surplus. As the trains started to run through East Prussia and the Russian Empire, a lot of cheap goods were being brought in, and cheap labor being brought in from other places in Prussia and the Russian Empire. So now you have a lot of farmhands and craftsmen that are out of work because they just are either not able to sell their goods or aren't able to find farms to work on. Another big reason for immigration to the U.S. was mandatory conscription into the Tsar's army. Again, the Deutsche aus Litauen belonged to the Russian Empire from 1815 until Lithuanian independence. So just like everybody else in the Russian Empire, they were required to serve 7 years of active military service. They would be taken away from home, usually somewhere else in the Russian Empire, to serve that service. Occasionally, they were able to come home either to marry or if there was an emergency, but generally speaking, they were away from home for 7 years. After their 7-year active conscription, they were usually in the reserves, I believe, for about 12 years. And of course, if there was any kind of military action, they would be called up to serve. So for a lot of young men, especially, this was a really big reason why they wanted to leave home. Conditions in the Tsar's army was terrible. Because they were ethnically German, they were treated poorly to begin with by the Russian authorities, so it was a big motivation to leave. Also, land inheritance customs in the German Empire, and this is common in a lot of places in Europe. But when a person dies, and when a father dies, his land and all of his property goes to his eldest son. And so, especially for young women, if you were a young woman in Southwest Lithuania at this time, and you really had two choices. You could either marry somebody and be taken care of, or you could be taken care of by a family member. I suppose the third choice, of course, would be to leave and come to the U.S., where you had a better chance of possibly getting a job and having a better quality of life. Legal immigration in this area was nearly impossible. Technically speaking, you were supposed to go to certain offices. Many of them were located miles from each other to get permission from the Russian government to leave Russia. And then, of course, you had to pay all these fees. And even if you went through that process of getting the stamps on your passport and paying all the fees, in most cases, your application to leave was denied. So there began a smuggling operation across the East Prussian border in Southwest Lithuania that, for whatever reason, was almost entirely run by the Jewish population there. I'm not entirely sure why, but they seem to really latch on to this trade. And they would help those in the area immigrate across the East Prussian border so that they could get to Hamburg or to Klemmen to get on a ship to leave to the U.S. And so they would pay a small fee. The border was pretty soft. It was fairly easy to cross over. And once a Russian subject was in East Prussia, they were protected by the Prussian government, and they were not able to be extradited. So once you got across the border, that was it. You were home free. And so the reality is most of these people were leaving and emigrating illegally. Rates of return were high for the Lithuanian immigrants compared with some other populations. It was very common for the Deutsche aus Litauen and others from this part of Lithuania to come to the U.S., make a lot of money, and then go back to Lithuania to support their family. And sometimes they would do this over a number of years. They would leave Lithuania, come to the U.S., make a bucket of money, take it home, come back, etc. So that is sort of an interesting feature that isn't as common in some of the other some of the other immigrant groups here in the U.S. So World War I, of course, by 1915, eventually Lithuania is occupied by Germany. It becomes part of the Ober-Ost territory. And because the Deutsche aus Litauen in this area were of conscription age, they would have served in the Russian army. And this would really become a very awkward situation for this group. Here they are just across the border from East Prussia, where they might have family members, parents, siblings, cousins, etc. And now they're being called up to service to essentially take up arms and be on the other side of a front, possibly a gun pointed at their relatives. So it would have been a very tough situation, but they were required to serve, and many did. By the time that Germany occupies Lithuania, it's important to note that the German army, many of them were coming from other places in the Reich, and many of them had no idea what Lithuania was. They had never heard the Lithuanian language. Again, Lithuania since 1807, 1815 had been part of Russia. And in the Reich, Germans really saw Russia as being this very foreign, backward place in the East with very odd people speaking a very odd language. There were a lot of really terrible stereotypes. And so here these troops come into Lithuania, and they're absolutely perplexed by the entire situation. They're hearing this very ancient language that they don't understand. They have individuals who are speaking German and a version of German that many of them would not have recognized. Some of them are identified as being German, even though they have Lithuanian names or Polish names or Russian names. Then there are individuals who have very clear Lithuanian and Polish and Russian names, identifying themselves as being German. And there's a famous case, this is from a book called Warland on the Eastern Front, about the three families of Schmidt in Mariampol in Lithuania. And here it says, besides a family by the German name of Schmidt, there was also in this multilingual area family names Kowalski and Kuznetsov, which both mean Smith. It's kind of the Polish and Russian versions of Schmidt in Polish and Russian. But German observers noted that we discover with a sense of distress that all three have distanced themselves far from their national identity, because Herr Schmidt, who on top of everything else carries the given name Heinrich, professes himself as an incarnate nationalist Pole, and Mr. Kowalski as a thorough Russian, and the apparently Muscovite Mr. Kuznetsov as a genuine German. And so this is the situation that these occupying forces are really being made aware of, and it was an interesting dynamic. You would think that the occupying German forces would have naturally been attracted to the Deutsche aus Litauen, but they were very suspicious and very confused by the entire situation. Eventually, they do sort of start to get help from the Deutsche aus Litauen so that the German army can communicate with the local Lithuanian population. But they were very suspicious of just about everybody in the population. The Russian and Soviet officials were also very suspicious of the Germans, especially before the German army captures the area. Many of them were sent off to Siberia or were shot on the spot because there were, of course, suspicions that these local Germans were spies or collaborating with the German army. At the end of World War I, I should say, Lithuania gains independence. Contrary to common belief, the Deutsche aus Litauen, most of them supported Lithuanian independence. By 1918, 1919, a lot of the Deutsche aus Litauen had been born and raised in Lithuania. Some of them had never been to East Prussia. It was their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents who had come. So they had grown up in Lithuania. They had Lithuanian friends. They spoke Lithuanian. And so they were very much supportive of this idea that they were their own nation. Of course, I mentioned earlier the Kultiva Band was established in the 1920s to protect the rights of Germans in Lithuania. We even have some Germans who joined the Lithuanian military. I mean, this really was an expression of how deeply they cared about their nation and how much they viewed themselves as being Lithuanian and not just German. Bad relations did exist in the Lutheran church community between the native Lithuanians and the Germans. By the 1923, 1924, there was really a big surge of Lithuanian nationalism that was happening in the country. And traditionally, the Lutheran churches, even though they had native Lithuanian members, were completely run by the German families. The administration was German, the clergy was German, education and services were in German, and the Lithuanian nationalists really wanted this to stop. They wanted the church to be run by Lithuanians. They wanted service to be in Lithuanian. They wanted to squash the teaching of the German language. And so there did become a conflict between these two groups. But even so, even with that conflict, overall, during this period of Lithuanian independence, the Deutsche aus Litauen families lived very peacefully alongside their Lithuanian neighbors. They worked together, they socialized together. I have pictures of wedding photos of my Deutsche aus Litauen family in which half of the people in the photos are local, are neighboring Lithuanian families, because they were very close. And in fact, although it was very uncommon, it did happen that Protestant Germans would marry into Catholic Lithuanian families and vice versa. And then we have World War II. So in 1939, October of 1939, Adolf Hitler gives a speech to the Reichstag in where he utters this phrase, Heim ins Reich, which essentially means come home to the Reich. And what he was talking about were this concept of Volksdeutsche, the German people who were living outside of the borders of the Reich. There were Germans living all over Europe, not just in Lithuania, but in Latvia, in mainland Russia, Italy, France, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. I mean, there were Germans everywhere living outside of the Reich. And as many people will know, the Hitler and especially Himmler believed that they needed to bring these Germans back to the Reich to strengthen it, and especially because this population of Volksdeutsche was mainly engaged in rural activities, farming and trades. They wanted them to populate East Prussia so that they could kind of continue to fuel the breadbasket of the Reich, and also to sort of serve as these pseudo-farming soldiers. It was this very bizarre, Nazi theory that they could really populate the East with these Volksdeutsche. And in order to do that, in order to relocate all of these so-called ethnic Germans out of Germany and into the east of the Reich, East Prussia mainly, they needed to give them citizenship in the Reich. And to do that, the Nazi government established several different organizations. One of those was the Einwandererzentralstelle, which really it means Central Immigration Office, or the EWZ, which is one of those organizations that was charged with inspecting these so-called Volksdeutsche outside of Germany and determine if they could get citizenship in the Reich and where within the Reich they would be relocated. The main place for relocation was the East, or Ost, mainly in East Prussia and what is today parts of Poland, or to the Altreich, which are the pre-1939 borders of Germany. The Altreich was really, the people that were sent there were either sent because they were deemed not German enough or were anti-German, or because their occupation or their knowledge was too vital to the war effort. So people who were highly educated or highly skilled would be sent to the Altreich really to work within the Nazi administration. So for the Germans from Lithuania, in 1941, they were faced with this choice. By this point, Lithuania was being occupied by the Soviet Union, and many of them remembered what it was like to live under Russian rule, and that was certainly not something that was very desirable for them. So they had two choices. They could stay in Lithuania and suffer under Soviet rule, or they could go to the Reich and find relative, safety under the Nazi regime. There's a very common misconception, not just among the Deutsche aus Litauen, but in other groups that were part of this relocation, that the relocation, the Heims in Reich program, was involuntary. And that is, I have found absolutely no evidence, and of course I haven't seen every possible source out there, but I have found no evidence that the Nazis were forcing people to relocate from Lithuania into the Reich. In fact, there were testimony that stated that the Soviet Union would not allow propaganda to be distributed in Lithuania about the relocation. Now, that being said, there were, of course, the Kulturverband, which was being heavily influenced by the Nazi government at this point, that were having meetings with Germans and were certainly encouraging them. But personally, I have found no evidence to support the idea that this relocation was involuntary. Again, you have to remember their situation. They either stay in Lithuania under Soviet rule, and the Soviets do not like the Germans at this point, or they could go at least to a place where they are given citizenship and shelter and protection. So the choice was really not not a hard one to make at that point. They ended up being relocated mostly to relocation camps in what is today Poland, in places like Litzmannstadt or Lodz. And many of them stayed in those camps for a number of years before they were supposed to be relocated to farms within East Prussia. Many of them were never actually relocated within the Reich. Many of them stayed in those relocation camps. However, there were the Deutsche the original intention of the Heimsenreich program was, let's relocate the Germans to the Reich, and then some of them will be able to go home when those places are under Nazi control. And that was certainly the case in Lithuania. Eventually, the Germans occupied Lithuania, and so there was quite a number of Deutsche aus Litauen who were actually taken back to Lithuania, back home. Some of them came back home to their original farms. In some cases, they were relocated to other places because their original farms were being occupied by others, but many of them didn't come back. And then, of course, at the end of the war, when the Red Army recaptured Lithuania, most of the Deutsche aus Litauen that were still there had fled to East Prussia and then eventually west. Those who were captured either in Lithuania or East Prussia, as many people will know, were either killed on the spot or sent to Russia, never to be seen again. Here we have an image of the Deutsche aus Litauen arriving in East Prussia during their relocation in 1941. And here we have an image of the flight to the west from East Prussia in 1944 and 1945. As far as the Deutsche aus Litauen today, after Lithuania becomes part of the Soviet Union after the end of World War II, the Deutsche aus Litauen were obviously no longer welcome there. Returning to their Heimat was virtually impossible. Many of them, of course, settled in Germany, especially in West Germany, but they were not able to even come back and visit Lithuania until it gained independence again in 1990. By the time Lithuania gains independence in 1990 and the Deutsche aus Litauen, those who were still alive to visit, would come back to villages that no longer existed, especially villages that were nearly entirely German. The Soviet Union, when they came through in 1945 and even afterwards, really made a big effort to remove any bastions or reminders of German life in Lithuania. Homes, businesses, churches, and especially graveyards were either neglected because the Germans, were no longer there, or were purposely, disassembled in order to erase the history of the Germans there. Again, most of the Germans settled in Germany, especially in West Germany, but not exclusively. But many of them also came overseas to the U.S., Canada, Australia, the UK, and South America. Canada and Australia especially did have actually had relocation programs to get Lutherans out, especially Canada, actually, to get Lutherans in Germany out of Germany and into Canada. And so a lot of them did settle in North America. So now we know a little bit. Now, hopefully by now you have a good, at least enough understanding to be dangerous about who these ethnic Germans were in Lithuania. The fact that there were sort of three different groups. We have the Prussian Lithuanians in the Memoland, one group. We have the early Germans that were living in places like Kaunan and Vilna. And then we have the Deutsche aus Litauen. And so hopefully you have a good understanding of who these people were and that they were a distinct group. And now I'd like to talk a little bit more about records and resources. So this really gets into the IAGL and what we do and what we offer. So church books are by far probably the most vital source of genealogical information for individuals from this area. The records were created and maintained by Lutheran churches in Lithuania. And of course, they fall under the same format and guidelines of doing genealogical research in Russia, Poland, as far as the formats of the records and the language that they were kept in. They were also serving as civil records because, unlike in Prussia, there was no civil registry office in the German Empire. The church records were actually the civil records. The people writing them, the church clergy, were acting as civil servants. Records for the Deutsche aus Litauen and Lutheran records, just like all the other ones, were kept in Polish from essentially, by the time the Germans arrived until 1867, 1868, when Russia then required all records to be written in Russian. Records during the interwar period between 1915 and 18 vary in language. Some are in German, some are in Russian, some are in Lithuanian, and some are a combination of all three, which makes it very difficult for some people to do this research. Records after 1918, when Lithuania becomes independent, are, of course, in the Lithuanian language until the end of the war in 1945. Many of the church books, of course, just like in East Prussia and West Prussia, were destroyed during the First and Second World Wars. These churches did suffer massive record losses. There are, in some cases, where the majority of the records are gone for some of these parishes, which is very unfortunate. Here on the left, we have a picture of the Lutheran Church in Wirbalen, one of the very early German communities in southwest Lithuania. On the left, this was a photograph taken sometime in the early 20th century. And on the right, you see an image of the church today. A lot of these churches during the Soviet period after the Second World War were actually used to store manure and other farming implements. The church in Kalvaria, for example, Lutheran Church in Kalvaria, was used as a boxing club and a rec room. And it was only really until Lithuanian independence in 1990 when these were starting to finally be preserved. And so most of them now, many of them have been restored. The Wirbalen Church has not, but many of them are now historic sites, thank God. Church books, as far as where they're located today, are mainly in archives in Lithuania, but also Poland and Germany. As far as other records dedicated to the Deutsche aus Litauen that are of interest are obviously the records produced by the Einwandererzentralstelle, the EWZ. These records are located at the Family History Library, also NARA, which is National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, Maryland, and the Bundesarchiv in Berlin. There's also records including those who relocated in 1941 back to Lithuania. There's a separate set of records on them at the Bundesarchiv. And then those who were specifically recruited into the German army. Many of the Deutsche aus Litauen, like other Volksdeutsche during World War II, were either recruited voluntarily, in some cases conscripted into the Wehrmacht, into the Waffen-SS, into the Nazi police force. So many of them did serve. In fact, I believe the statistics for Volksdeutsche serving in World War II, I think, is somewhere around over 500,000. The Lithuanian Secret Police list, which is now in our collection as the International Association of Germans in Lithuania, but the originals are located at the Lithuanian Archives. This was a police list put together by the Lithuanian government in 1938 to spy on the Germans living there to determine whether or not they were loyal to the Lithuanian state. That is actively being transcribed and put into our online database. It's not there yet, but it is a work in progress. Evangelical Central Archive in Berlin. This one is important because after World War II, in the 1950s, the Lutheran Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Berlin, started a drive to get people from Lithuania to submit copies of their birth records and marriage records, etc., so that they could have a centralized database. Fortunately, it's heavily restricted today, but it does still exist at the center in Berlin. The 1923 census, available at the Lithuanian Archives. Internal Lithuanian passports, which were required in 1918, 1919 by the Lithuanian government. Those exist in Lithuanian archives, but the collection is very fractured because many of them, of course, were lost. The Auswanderungskarte der Litauendeutsche from 1715 to 1938 was an index created to document Lithuania, East Prussian or German people who came over to Lithuania. That collection is available at the Family History Library as well as the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz. And then the Arlesen Archives Online, which are free online records from the International Tracing Services via arlesenarchives.org. This is a really great collection for those who would have any records of being, that received any kind of aid or assistance during their flight to the West after the Second World War. And then, of course, our own online index, the International Association of Germans from Lithuania. We have transcribed over 60,000 as of this month records from evangelical Lutheran churches in Southwest Lithuania. That includes birth, marriage, and death and confirmation records, which we translate from either Russian, Polish, German, or Lithuanian and put on this index. It is 100% completely free to anybody. The website is index.germansfromlithuania.org, where you can search. We're continuing to transcribe additional records from other church communities. You can see our index inventory at germansfromlithuania.org, which we update constantly. And additionally, we're adding non-church records as well. The reason why the church records, of course, are the focus is because they really are the civil records, and civil registries did not exist in the Russian Empire. But we also have these other records, such as the 1938 Lithuanian secret police list, which is still being worked on, but will eventually be in this database, as well as EWZ records, both from the Family History Library and also EWZ records from the Bundesarchiv, which we've recently gotten permission to transcribe and include. We also, in this database, we have images from church books that are not accessible via familysearch.org. We have a very close relationship with the Lithuanian archives, and so we do have permission to photograph those, and so you can access records that you normally would not be able to access unless you go to the Family History Library in Salt Lake City or unless you are at a Family History affiliate location. We just recently, actually Monday, we're giving access to everybody starting today, but Monday we are announcing the first issue of our publication called Die Weite. It's free. The first issue is free to download on our website, but in the future it will be issued biannually, both in digital and print form. It includes stories and history of the Germans from Lithuania, and also news and resources for records and other information that's applicable to this group. You can download it on our website again, and then if you want to receive future issues, you can submit a donation to the IAGL and receive this as a gift for your donation. So that's all I have to share on the Germans from Lithuania. Hopefully, I know it's a lot of information. I ran through it sort of quickly, but the goal really was to give people some information about this group and have at least a base understanding of why the Deutsche aus Litauen is its own sort of individual group within the broader scope of Germans from Lithuania. And hopefully you have some more information about their history and how you can research them. Obviously, we have a website, and then we do have a Facebook group. If you are doing research in this area, this is really where we post news about updates to our index. It's where we have a lot of really talented genealogists from all over the world who are on this group that are very skilled researchers that can help if you have a question or need some resources. So it's a great place to start. But with that, I'd really like to open it to the group for any questions or comments or feedback. Would certainly love to hear from you.